The office was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner, a steady backdrop to the soft rustling of papers and the occasional click of a keyboard. The millionaire, Alexander Carter, strode into the room, his polished shoes tapping sharply against the marble floor. His eyes, sharp and discerning, scanned the office like a hawk searching for prey, and the tension in the air thickened instantly. Everyone instinctively straightened, papers paused mid-air, as if even the office plants knew not to breathe too loudly. Alexander had returned from a high-profile business trip, and his mood was clearly unsettled. The kind of unsettled that made deals crumble before the first sentence was spoken. He stopped at his secretary's desk, his gaze narrowing. "Where's the report I asked for?" he demanded, his voice low but commanding. The usual hum of apologies and nervous stammering began to rise, but then came a voice that cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "Be quiet." The words were calm, almost casual, but the authority behind them made Alexander pause mid-step. It was Julia, a relatively new employee, young but poised beyond her years. Her eyes met his without fear, her hands resting lightly on the edge of her desk. There was something in her calmness, in the way she refused to shrink, that made the room feel different, almost as if the air itself had shifted. Alexander blinked, taken aback. He was used to people trembling at his presence, nodding frantically to avoid confrontation. This woman, however, didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, an unspoken challenge glinting in her gaze. The effect was immediate. Alexander's anger, which had been simmering just below the surface, seemed to stall, trapped somewhere between disbelief and curiosity. The office staff exchanged nervous glances, some audibly sighing in relief. For the first time in years, someone had dared to stop Alexander Carter in his tracks. Julia didn't waste a moment. She reached for the report, which had been meticulously compiled but buried under a stack of less important documents. Her fingers moved confidently, retrieving it without hesitation, and placed it gently on Alexander's desk. "This is the report you requested," she said, her tone steady and unembellished. Alexander leaned closer, scanning the pages, expecting some small flaw, some excuse to dismiss her competence. But there was none. Every chart, every figure, every analysis was precise, comprehensive, and delivered with clarity. He looked up at her again, this time with an expression that was part admiration, part disbelief. You did this all yourself?" he asked, the words betraying a hint of astonishment. Julia nodded, her expression serene. "Yes, I've been working on it for several days. I made sure nothing was overlooked." The calm, methodical approach, coupled with her quiet confidence, was disarming. Alexander, who had always believed that authority came from volume and intimidation, suddenly felt something unfamiliar, a need to listen rather than command. The tension in the room shifted from oppressive to electric, as if a storm had paused mid-air, waiting for the next move. "You've changed the way I see this entire project," Alexander admitted, almost reluctantly. His voice was lower now, stripped of its usual sharp edge. Julia's behavior had done more than deliver a report. It had altered the dynamics of power in the room, showing that respect could be earned without fear. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible smile tugging at the corners of Alexander's lips. He realized that he had been trapped in a cycle of arrogance, assuming that authority meant intimidation. Julia's quiet assertiveness, her unwavering poise, had dismantled that assumption effortlessly. The rest of the staff, sensing the shift, began to exhale collectively, their own anxieties easing. The office felt lighter, the oppressive air lifted. Alexander sat down, opening the report again, but this time with genuine interest, as if seeing the numbers for the first time. "Explain your methodology to me," he said, not as a challenge, but as a request. Julia leaned slightly forward, ready to present her insights, her demeanor professional yet approachable. She spoke with clarity, outlining each step, the reasoning behind every decision, and the implications of the findings. Alexander listened, genuinely engaged, for the first time in years feeling the thrill of intellectual exchange rather than the hollow satisfaction of power asserted. Hours passed, but it felt like minutes. Every question he asked, Julia answered with precision, anticipating follow-ups before they were voiced. Alexander found himself nodding, jotting down notes, and occasionally leaning back, marveling at her thought process. The dynamic had shifted completely. By the time the late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting warm streaks of light across the desk, Alexander felt a profound respect growing for the young employee who had dared to speak 3 words, "Be quiet," and, in doing so, had altered the course of the day, perhaps even his own approach to leadership. The office, once a place of tension and fear, now buzzed with a different energy, curiosity, admiration, and the quiet power of competence paired with confidence. Julia returned to her work, the faintest smile on her lips. Knowing she had done more than deliver a report, she had changed everything. Alexander left his desk briefly to pace the length of his office, his mind swirling with thoughts he hadn't expected to entertain. Julia's calm defiance and meticulous competence kept replaying in his head like a persistent echo. Every step he took felt heavy with self-awareness, a rare and uncomfortable sensation for someone used to commanding with absolute certainty. He stopped at the window, staring out at the city skyline, as if the towering buildings could offer him clarity. Normally, he would have dismissed any internal reflection in favor of action, but today, something had shifted. He felt a curiosity he hadn't felt in years, a hunger to understand not just the numbers on a page, but the human behind the work. He returned to the conference room where Julia had already begun organizing her notes for the next project update, her movements efficient yet unhurried, the picture of focus and calm. Alexander leaned against the doorway, observing quietly, resisting the urge to assert control. He realized he had always equated control with fear and obedience, but Julia's quiet assurance suggested another form of influence, one rooted in knowledge, preparation, and the confidence to speak truth to power. He could see it in the way she arranged the charts, double-checking every figure, and anticipating the questions that would naturally arise. There was no posturing, no attempt to impress with grandiose statements. Just precision, clarity, and a sense of responsibility that made the room feel different, almost respectful in its stillness. Alexander's phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at it, expecting urgent messages demanding decisions, but hesitated. For the first time in years, he didn't feel compelled to respond immediately. Instead, he watched Julia as she explained a complex scenario to one of his junior managers, her tone firm yet patient, guiding without condescending, correcting without embarrassment. He realized he had been missing this, true leadership that inspired rather than intimidated. His own approach had relied on volume, on forceful authority, on fear masked as respect. Yet here was Julia, changing minds and shifting dynamics without raising her voice beyond 3 words, "Be quiet." The simplicity and effectiveness of it stunned him. Alexander finally spoke, his voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. "Julia, come here." She turned, her expression composed, expecting instruction, but instead he gestured to the chair across from him. She sat, the confidence unwavering, and he found himself struggling for the words he usually wielded like weapons. I want to understand your approach better," he admitted, leaning back, fingers steepled. Julia nodded, serene, as though she had anticipated this moment. She outlined her strategy, explaining the rationale behind every recommendation, every projection, the potential risks, and the contingency plans. Alexander listened, captivated. For once, it wasn't about asserting dominance. It was about learning, understanding, and seeing a perspective he had ignored for years. Hours passed, and the sun dipped lower, casting golden streaks across the polished floor. He realized the energy in the office had transformed. Where tension and fear had dominated, now there was engagement, collaboration, and a quiet excitement. Employees moved with purpose, asking questions, sharing ideas, inspired by Julia's example. Alexander felt an unfamiliar sense of humility, a recognition that true influence didn't come from yelling or intimidation, but from competence, preparation, and the courage to act with integrity. He looked at Julia again, noting the way her hands rested lightly on her notes, how she maintained eye contact without arrogance, how she balanced authority and approachability with effortless grace. He realized that her impact extended beyond the projects she managed. She was reshaping the office culture, subtly but profoundly. A junior analyst approached with a question about a financial model, and Julia responded with clarity, guiding him through the nuances without condescension. Alexander watched, amazed at how seamlessly she inspired confidence in others. He understood now that her three simple words had done more than stop him from speaking. They had established a tone, a new standard for communication, for respect, and for collaboration. That night, long after the office had emptied and the city lights blinked like distant stars, Alexander sat alone reviewing the report again, not with the intent to critique, but to understand. He felt a shift within himself, a recognition that leadership could be transformative, empathetic, and quietly powerful. Julia's behavior had ignited something inside him, a desire to rethink the way he approached people, decisions, and influence. He realized that true change didn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes, it came from someone having the courage to be calm, composed, and assertive in the right way, and from someone else having the humility to see the lesson and embrace it. By the end of the night, Alexander felt a mixture of respect, curiosity, and determination. Julia had changed the office dynamic, altered the way he viewed leadership, and challenged him to be better, not through confrontation, but through quiet confidence. And as he finally left the office, the city lights reflecting in his eyes, he knew one thing with certainty. The way forward would be different. He would no longer lead by fear. He would lead by understanding, by listening, and by empowering those who prove their worth not with loud words, but with actions. And it all started with three simple words: be quiet. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the office earlier than usual, a restless energy coursing through him that he couldn't quite explain. He expected tension, the usual buzz of employees nervously preparing for his entrance, but instead, the atmosphere felt different, lighter, more purposeful. Julia was already at her desk, reviewing projections with meticulous care, and she looked up briefly as he entered, giving a small, acknowledging nod. Alexander paused, observing the subtle shift that had taken place overnight. Her influence was evident not just in her work, but in the way the team operated around her. Junior employees moved confidently, exchanging ideas and asking questions without hesitation. The usual undercurrent of fear that had permeated the office was replaced by a quiet focus, a sense of accountability and engagement. Alexander felt a strange mix of pride and unease. Pride because he recognized the value Julia had brought to the table, and unease because it forced him to confront his own long-standing habits of intimidation and control. He sat down, spreading out the reports and notes that had accumulated while he was away, and watched Julia as she moved among her colleagues, answering questions, offering guidance, and gently correcting mistakes with an ease that suggested authority didn't have to be loud or threatening. Her presence seemed magnetic. People were drawn to her competence, inspired by her calm assertiveness, and motivated to perform at a higher level. Alexander realized he had been blind for years, equating fear with respect and command with loyalty, never noticing that true influence often came quietly, subtly, and persistently. He cleared his throat, a deliberate sound to catch her attention, and she turned toward him with the same composed expression that had unsettled him before. "I want to discuss the Thompson deal," he said, motioning for her to join him at the table. She complied without hesitation, her posture poised, her gaze steady. He felt a flicker of anxiety, an unusual feeling for someone who was used to controlling every conversation, but he pushed it aside, determined to engage in a meaningful exchange rather than a performance of authority. "Your analysis yesterday was thorough," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I need your insight on how we can approach the negotiation differently. I want honest opinions, no sugarcoating." Julia nodded, her calmness unwavering, and began outlining a strategy, explaining the nuances of the deal, the potential risks, and the opportunities that most executives might overlook. She spoke with clarity, precision, and confidence, and Alexander listened intently, noting the depth of her understanding and the foresight in her recommendations. He asked questions, probing her reasoning, and she responded with patience and insight, anticipating follow-ups and clarifying potential uncertainties. For the first time, Alexander experienced a conversation not as a monologue of control, but as a dynamic exchange of ideas. He found himself valuing her perspective, appreciating the way she challenged assumptions without confrontation, and guiding without domination. The discussion extended over hours, yet time seemed irrelevant. Every moment was absorbed in strategy, analysis, and mutual engagement. Alexander realized that Julia's influence went beyond the technical work she performed. Her behavior was reshaping his perception of leadership, demonstrating that authority could coexist with respect, empathy, and collaboration. Her calm, deliberate approach had a ripple effect, transforming the office culture in ways he hadn't anticipated. Employees were more engaged, more willing to contribute, and more confident in their abilities. Alexander observed quietly, marveling at the subtle, profound impact of her presence. By the afternoon, he found himself reflecting on his own leadership style, acknowledging patterns of arrogance and impatience that had hindered his effectiveness. He recognized that his previous reliance on fear and dominance had stifled creativity, initiative, and loyalty. Julia's behavior had illuminated a different path, one where competence, composure, and thoughtful guidance commanded respect more powerfully than any raised voice ever could. When the team gathered for the afternoon briefing, Alexander spoke differently than usual. He asked questions rather than issuing directives, encouraged dialogue rather than expecting compliance, and acknowledged contributions openly. Julia's quiet guidance influenced the flow of conversation, steering the team toward solutions without overtly asserting control. The dynamic was transformative. Employees were engaged, focused, and motivated, contributing ideas with confidence, and Alexander felt a genuine sense of pride in the collaborative energy that had taken root. As the day drew to a close, he realized that the shift wasn't just temporary, it was foundational. Julia had shown him that leadership wasn't about commanding obedience, but about inspiring capability, confidence, and trust. Her behavior had changed not just his perspective, but the entire culture of his office. Alone in his office later, Alexander reviewed the notes and reports once more, his mind racing with plans for implementing this new approach more broadly. He understood that true power came not from fear, but from the ability to influence through competence, calmness, and clarity of purpose. And he knew that the catalyst for this transformation had been Julia's simple yet profoundly effective act of saying, "Be quiet." That single moment had sparked a series of events that altered his understanding of leadership forever. He leaned back in his chair, eyes reflecting both contemplation and determination, recognizing that the journey ahead would be different. He would no longer rely on intimidation or authority alone. He would cultivate respect, inspire confidence, and lead with understanding. Julia's behavior had changed everything, and he knew he could never look at leadership the same way again. The following week, Alexander arrived at the office with a sense of anticipation he hadn't felt in years. He noticed immediately how the energy in the office had shifted permanently. Conversations were purposeful, colleagues exchanged ideas confidently, and there was a subtle hum of collaboration that replaced the former tension and apprehension. Julia was already at her desk, focused on a new initiative, her composure unchanged, her calm authority influencing the room without a word. Alexander watched her quietly, marveling at how effortlessly she commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. Today, he had a meeting with a potential investor, a high-stakes presentation that could determine the future of the company, and normally he would have dominated the room with assertiveness, expecting everyone to follow his lead without question. But something in him had changed. He realized that true leadership required more than control. It required preparation, understanding, and the ability to empower others to excel. He invited Julia to join the meeting, not out of obligation, but because he trusted her insight and valued her perspective. The investor arrived, a formidable figure with a reputation for scrutinizing every detail, and Alexander began the presentation differently than he ever had before. He allowed Julia to explain the projections, the strategy, and the rationale behind their recommendations. Her voice was steady, confident, and persuasive, each point reinforced by data and foresight. Alexander noticed the subtle shift in the investor's demeanor. Where there might have been skepticism, there was now engagement, a willingness to consider, and even moments of admiration. He realized that Julia's presence had transformed not only his approach, but the perception of the company itself. During the discussion, questions arose that could have rattled anyone unprepared, but Julia answered each one with clarity and authority, anticipating follow-ups and addressing potential concerns before they were fully voiced. Alexander felt an unusual sense of calm. He wasn't leading by force, but by collaboration, guided by the quiet strength of the employee who had challenged him weeks before. The investor leaned forward, intrigued, and asked for more details about market expansion, projections, and risk mitigation. Julia responded without hesitation, presenting a plan that was meticulous yet flexible, demonstrating not only competence but vision. Alexander observed her carefully, realizing how much he had underestimated the impact of someone who led through knowledge and poise rather than volume and aggression. The investor nodded, impressed, and Alexander felt a surge of pride, not pride in himself, but in recognizing and supporting the talent of someone who had changed the trajectory of the company and, indirectly, of his own leadership. The meeting concluded successfully, with the investor expressing confidence and willingness to partner, and Alexander knew that the difference lay not in his previous bravado, but in the calm, calculated influence Julia had brought. Back in the office, he reflected on the past weeks. The subtle changes in the office culture, the way colleagues now communicated openly, the confidence that had replaced hesitation, and the energy of mutual respect, were directly attributable to Julia's courage to speak up and assert herself. Her words, "Be quiet," had seemed simple at the time, almost casual, yet they carried weight that neither of them fully understood in that moment. They had challenged his assumptions, forced him to reconsider the nature of authority, and inspired a transformation that extended beyond a single interaction or project. Alexander now saw leadership as a shared responsibility, a partnership between vision and execution, where influence was earned and respect was mutual. He approached Julia, who had returned to her desk to continue refining the next initiative. "Thank you," he said quietly, a tone of genuine respect in his voice. She looked up, her expression composed but not unreadable, and nodded. "You don't need to thank me," she replied calmly, almost matter-of-factly. Yet Alexander understood that her impact went far beyond any single report or presentation. It was the way she carried herself, the way she approached challenges, and the subtle power of her presence that had changed everything. That afternoon, Alexander held an informal meeting with his leadership team, encouraging input, fostering dialogue, and emphasizing collaboration over command. He noticed the stark contrast from prior meetings, where his presence had often stifled discussion. The team was energized, engaged, and even more committed to their work. Alexander realized that Julia's influence had extended beyond her own role. She had reshaped the culture of the organization, transforming it into a space where competence, confidence, and respectful dialogue thrived. As the day came to a close, Alexander sat alone in his office, reflecting on the lessons he had learned. He realized that the journey from authority through fear to authority through respect was not easy, but it was essential. Julia's simple yet profound act of speaking up, of asserting herself calmly and confidently, had shifted not only his leadership style, but the very atmosphere of the company. The transformation was permanent, subtle, yet undeniable. Alexander knew that he could never revert to his old ways, and he felt a sense of gratitude and determination to continue this new approach. Leadership, he understood now, was not about domination or volume. It was about insight, empathy, preparation, and the courage to act with integrity. Julia's behavior had changed everything, and the company, the employees, and Alexander himself were all better for it. He leaned back in his chair, a rare smile forming, knowing that the path forward would be defined by collaboration, respect, and thoughtful influence. All of it had started with 3 simple words: "Be quiet." And in those words lay a lesson he would carry for the rest of his career. A reminder that true power is quiet, subtle, and transformative, capable of changing not just a single day, but an entire life, and even the course of a company's future.